Bon, bon dia a tothom, benvinguts al segon dia del sisè Congrés IDP. Com avui sabeu avui que més aviat tindrem una línia, a diferència de la llei que era més centrada en el que era l'àmbit jurídic, avui estarà més centrada en el que és la participació ciutadana, el govern, l'administració pública. I per això hem convidat a la Karin Deutsch Karlekar perquè ens donés, igual que vam tenir ahir una petita introducció de la temàtica, ella que ens donés també unes primeres dades, una primera informació més bàsica, més fonamental de què s'està coent ara a internet. Suposo que coneixeu tots Freedom House. Freedom House porta pràcticament 60 anys treballant sobre la democràcia, sobre els valors de la democràcia, sobre els valors de la llibertat i és una ONG no governamental dels Estats Units que sobretot aquest esperit americà de la democràcia com una cosa, com un bé en si, això porta treballant, això porta uns pràcticament 60 anys, i més o menys els últims 10 anys ha tret dos índexs, que és Freedom in the World i l'altre és Freedom of the Press, que el que fa és mesurar, segons una sèrie pràcticament 50 indicadors, quin és l'estat de la llibertat en el món. Si hi ha llibertat de premsa, si no té llibertat d'expressió, si no té llibertat política, d'associació, etc. En els últims 2 anys, i està a punt de sortir, ahir em deia que no està tan a punt de sortir, han tret un nou índex que es diu Freedom of the Net, molt basat en el Freedom of the Press, i el que fa aquest índex és adaptar el que dèiem de l'índex sobre la llibertat de premsa, adaptar-lo a la realitat d'internet. Llavors introdueix variables com els bloggers, si hi ha censura dels canals d'internet o no, etc. Va haver-hi l'any passat la primera edició, aquest any havia de sortir aquesta primavera la segona edició, ja tenen les dades, per tant jo crec que sí que ens poden ensenyar algunes coses, però segurament sortirà a la tardor. La idea de portar a la Karin Deutsch, que a més és doctora en història de l'Àsia i els processos també de democratització de l'Àsia, era precisament això, dir, el panorama a internet i en el món és aquestes són les dades, és amb això amb el que estem treballant, de manera que les persones que vinguin després a parlar durant el matí i la tarda puguem fer referència constantment a això. Quan parlem de participació ciutadana o parlem de coses que es poden fer a internet i coses que no podem fer, sempre tindrem aquest punt de partida de dir, teòricament sí, podem arribar fins aquí o no, però a la pràctica el punt de partida és aquest. Llavors, sense més dilació, us deixo amb la Karin Deutsch. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ismail, and just wanted to thank you for the invitation to come and speak and present on our recent project. We heard a lot yesterday about some of the other issues concerning cloud computing and sort of the growth of a sort of more globalized and system of computing in general. And overall, we've heard yesterday from people that in terms of sort of the changes in data management have had very positive and negative implications. Some of the positives, again, taking a little bit from what I heard yesterday, were sort of the cheaper aspects and more globalized access. On the negative side, we see that there are big issues concerning privacy, accessibility, and also some of the legal ramifications. If you look at the differences just in the legal differences between Europe and the US, what I'm going to try and talk about also is looking globally. There are many more problems when you add in countries like China to the mix, which have very much more restrictive environments for both media and for internet and ICTs. And what I'm going to also try and do is look a little bit more at the role of state actors and governments in restricting internet freedoms and and placing restrictions. So a lot of what we talked about yesterday was sort of changing roles of individuals, corporations, data service providers. So I'm going to try and add in a little bit to the role of sort of national and government actors. I'm framing the whole discussion through, it's a pilot project that we released last year, and I was the manager of the project and also heavily involved in the design of our methodology. We released it just over a year ago. It was called Freedom on the Net, and we are releasing another bigger edition probably later this year or early next year. So the pilot report contained an overview as well as analytical reports and numerical ratings for 15 countries. These countries were spread across the globe, and we picked them to sort of demonstrate the wide variety that currently exists in terms of environments for internet freedom. In our next edition, we hope to cover about 35 or 40 countries. And what we also try to do is be very expansive, so in not just looking at issues related to the internet, but also looking at other ICTs and ways of communicating news and information that are sort of only growing in importance, such as mobile phones and other forms of sharing information. When we tried to create the methodology and the sort of framing the project, we wanted to try and answer or delve into a certain number of questions. Given that internet and new media are sort of dominating and expanding in terms of the share of the flow of news and information around the world, what we really wanted to try and zoom in on when we created our methodology was to look at what techniques governments are using to control and censor online content. We also wanted to look at what all the main threats were to these forms of digital media and the freedom that exists in these mediums, and also what are some of the positive trends we saw and the uses of the technologies by the users. So it was a little bit, we tried to frame it a little bit differently than our long-standing Media Freedom Index, which I also manage. In terms of what the more traditional media, you obviously have a very, it's a slightly different model, although this is also changing, where you have content producers and then sort of users who sort of receive the content and get news and information. When you look at the internet and new media sphere, you also have users who are producing information. So it's a slightly different dynamic, and we wanted to try and capture this in our methodology by looking at how users were also using the technologies. And in many cases, they are using them in very interesting and creative ways. So what we tried to measure when we came up with the methodology was both access to the technologies as well as the free flow of information through the technologies without fear of repercussions. And we tried to cover both restrictions from government and non-state actors, although I would say there's a slight emphasis on the government role. We also purposefully decided to focus on political and social content, so there was less emphasis on, let's say, restrictions on, let's say, commercial aspects, cybercrime, and control over pornography, although they did come in a little bit into our methodology. When we devised the methodology, basically we were trying to have a very wide range of questions that covered the entire enabling environment for internet and digital media freedom. And we divided these into three broad categories, which were obstacles to access, limits on content, and then violation of user rights. I'll go into these three a little bit more in a minute. And each country we actually tried to create a similar scoring system to our Media Freedom Index so that the countries could be compared on both of our indices. So the numerical scoring system is a 0 to 100 scale, where 0 is the best score, 100 is the worst score. And then we also use that numerical analysis to create overall categories of free, partly free, or not free. And this is how we sort of create our maps and our other visuals. And I'd like to just jump in and thank Ismail for his comments. He was one of the people that provided very good feedback to us when we were involved in developing the methodology. So I just wanted to thank him for his input. We were trying to get input from a wide variety of researchers and experts in the field from both the United States, Europe, and then in different countries around the world. So looking a little bit more at the three categories in the methodology, and under obstacles to access, we wanted to cover a range of issues, and these included both purposeful government blocking of both technologies, such as broadband, or particular applications, and that would include things like YouTube, Facebook. We also wanted to look at infrastructural or economic barriers to access. These mostly would impact countries in the developing world, but not completely. And then we also tried to devise questions that would cover legal, regulatory, and ownership control, both over the infrastructure and over internet and mobile phone providers. Under the second category in the methodology, limits on content, This category was also fairly broad. We tried to cover issues of censorship, which would include filtering and blocking of websites, but also other forms of censorship, such as judicial orders. We also looked at self-censorship. We tried to look at issues concerning transparency and proportionality of censorship. In many countries, the government may say that they're trying to censor one type of content, but then the type of content being blocked is actually much broader than, let's say, pornography. So they also block political and social content. We also tried to look at the vibrancy and diversity of online news media and that sphere, and then also the use of digital media by activists for social and political causes. And the last category, which was actually the sort of given the biggest weight in our point system, we tried to look at both legal protections and restrictions on online activity, as well as repercussions, which include a wide range of issues, including sort of lawsuits and legal prosecution, imprisonment, physical attacks on bloggers and other individuals, and also cyber or dedicated denial of service attacks on websites. In this category, we also covered issues of surveillance and privacy, which what we found were an issue in both very free and very restrictive environments. So that's a little bit on our the way we try to frame the methodology, and I'll go into now basically an overview of our findings and what we found in the pilot study. This is a view of the world with the 15 countries that we covered in the pilot, and you can see that they're color-coded by the status that we gave them. So either free is green, partly free is yellow, and not free is purple. So overall, we found there was a huge variety in environments for internet freedom around the world. So of the 15 countries we covered, you can see Estonia came out at the best, and the United Kingdom, South Africa also performed very well. We had a very wide band of countries sort of in the middle range. And then in the sort of more restrictive environments, you have countries like Iran and China, which everyone has heard about in terms of being very, very restrictive. And Cuba came out the worst in our study. Cuba sort of, I think, stands out in that, as well as having a variety of other restrictions, they really try and limit access almost completely to the internet. So whereas other restrictive environments such as Iran and China, you do have many people accessing the internet. In Cuba, it's actually very difficult even to get access. In terms of overall findings, again, what we found was that there had been a huge growth in the use of the internet and in other mobile phone and ICT technologies. In the 2 years that we studied, 2006 to 2008, in 6 of the 15 countries, internet penetration had doubled, and in 3, mobile phone penetration had doubled. So there's been a huge growth in access, and this has continued in the years since, in the last 2 years since 2008. So we see this as a very positive trend, and it's set to continue. However, coupled with this sort of positive trend of growing access, have been a range of growing threats to the freedom of people to use the technologies. So overall, in the 15 countries, we found that 11 of the 15 had censored some political content in the period under study. 6 of the 15 had sentenced a blogger or online journalist to prison during that period. 5 had introduced new legislation which had the effect of restricting internet freedom. And what we also found was that the range of restrictions was spreading. So in terms of types of restrictions, we found that it wasn't just, let's say, blocking of content that was a problem, but that countries were engaging also in manipulation of content, in outsourcing sort of censorship and control, and in increasing a range of sort of legal and extra-legal repercussions. So focusing in on a few of the sort of thematic issues we noted. Looking at the first sort of issue of obstacles to access, we found that 7 of the 15 countries during the period that we studied had at some point, maybe not for all of the period, but at least for certain times, had blocked Web 2.0 applications. And this ranged from very restrictive countries, such as Iran and China, to relatively open and media freedom environments, such as Turkey, where they've been blocking YouTube. It's for some of the countries, the blocks have been almost total. In other places, they are, I would say, more connected to, let's say, particular periods of social or political unrest, where you see many more blocks on more types of technologies. What we also saw was that there are restrictions on the infrastructure itself. So I mentioned Cuba as an example of a country where access is almost completely restricted altogether. It's very, very difficult to access the global internet. There is an intranet within Cuba which is more accessible. But access is expensive, very slow, and you need government approval. Other countries which are somewhat more open, we see that Iran is a country which purposefully limits the speed of the internet and access to broadband, with the idea that it makes it more difficult for people to, let's say, access video and other technologies which take a lot of bandwidth. So that was one example we saw of a country which was purposefully limiting access to the technologies as a way to restrict users accessing certain types of content. So many of the things that we would take for granted, being able to click on a YouTube video and watch something, are very, very difficult in countries where you don't really have the bandwidth capacity or the speed to be able to do that. In terms of economic obstacles to access, not surprisingly, we found that sort of constraints on infrastructure and price were significant constraints in a range of low-income countries, including countries like Georgia, India, Kenya, and South Africa. But overall, their level of economic development was not a barrier per se to internet freedom. Many of these countries were among the better performers in our study overall. And positively, we found that particularly in Africa and in a few other places, the growth of the mobile web and being able to access the internet over mobile phones really has grown dramatically and is probably the way in which that form of technology will grow in these countries. So that was a very positive finding. Looking at censorship, we found that there had been some level of censorship in every country we studied, although for some this was not political and social censoring, it was more censoring of pornography. However, we found that in many of the countries, if not all, there was a significant lack of transparency in terms of censorship procedures, including in some democracies and very open environments, such as the United Kingdom. So, for example, a country would say that they're censoring certain types of content, but when you look at studies conducted by the OpenNet Initiative and other groups which really do in-depth studies on this type of thing, what you can find is that countries are censoring a much wider range of content than what they are ostensibly censoring. We also found that there were, in many countries, sort of a lack of clear procedures regarding censorship. There were not, let's say, lists available of blocked websites, and in some countries it was very difficult to have avenues for appeal. So if someone found their website blocked, there wasn't really a very good mechanism to deal with the situation. Apart from filtering of content, there are a wide range of techniques for censoring and blocking content. So you also have issues such as judicial orders or government directives where they're asking, let's say, website owners to take down certain types of content. So there's a wide range of censorship techniques. China's, I think, censorship apparatus can be considered probably the most sophisticated and multi-layered and has received quite a lot of attention globally, but many other countries do engage in some similar forms of censorship. Just to give an idea of what censorship looks like using filtering, we did a quick comparison of results using Google with results from Baidu, which is one of the top search engines in China. And we looked both for the terms Freedom House and Tiananmen Square. So I'll show a few screenshots which show the differences. So you see on the left, looking for Freedom House, images for Freedom House on Google, and then on the right you see what comes up if you're doing it in China. So very, very different. And then for Tiananmen Square, on the left, again, Google. So the tanks are dominating. And on the right, you have very different images. So obviously, the experience that someone in China has when they are using a filtered search engine is completely different than the experience one would have on Google. And this has become a huge issue, as many of you probably know. I mean, there is an ongoing sort of, I guess, battle of wills now going on between Google and the Chinese government about the level of filtering and censorship that they will engage in. I think probably the filtering is one of the issues in terms of internet freedom that's received probably the most attention. However, what we found is that there is significant growth in other forms of what we would call content manipulation. So many governments have realized, I think, that they can't really filter and censor all types of information. And so they're also engaging in sort of subtle or not so subtle manipulation of online content. China also engages in this. There's a group of people termed the 50 Cent Party, which numbers in the hundreds of thousands possibly, which is engaged in sort of posting comments on message boards and trying to direct the flow of online conversation. This phenomenon has also been noted in Russia. We've seen it in Tunisia. And since the study was put out, there have been comments from other countries that indicate that similar trends are going on in other countries. So in the last year or so, we heard even in Nigeria that the government is engaging in this form of activity. The other interesting thing we found was that censorship is being outsourced in many countries, so to private companies. And these companies include both local companies as well as some of the big international companies such as Google. And this is sort of a growing trend where censorship is being, the onus of censorship is not being placed on the government, but private companies are being forced to engage in these practices. And again, I mean, the most obvious example is probably Google in China, but there are many, many other examples. It's not just sort of companies and websites, but also other content providers, ISPs, cyber cafes, and mobile phone providers that are being forced to partake or take part in both censorship as well as surveillance of users. So this was a growing trend that we also found in the period under study. In terms of looking at legal repercussions for online activity, what we found was that many countries were using general media legislation against online activities, as well as, in some countries, development of internet-specific legislation. So many countries, when they're prosecuting, let's say, a blogger, would use legislation that already exists to cover, let's say, journalists or let's say, emergency laws, which could cover any type of activist. So this was very common. In some countries, they have been developing specific laws that either relate to the internet, or they are expanding, let's say, traditional media laws to cover internet and other online activities. What we found was that 6 of the 15 countries had sentenced a blogger during the time period covered. And sentences range in many countries, but China, unsurprisingly, you have the longest period in terms of jail time. There's also a huge issue in terms of legal responsibility for posting or hosting of content, and whether, let's say, ISPs or websites or blogs are responsible for, let's say, comments posted on the blog or the content that they publish. And this was an issue even in very open environments. In the United Kingdom, there's a ongoing issue, although it's begun to be addressed, of libel tourism, where people from one country can sue, let's say, a writer or a journalist or a news outlet based in another country in a United Kingdom court on the basis that some of the content was available online to readers in the United Kingdom. So the range of legal sort of differences in different countries and sort of shopping around for friendly legal sort of laws, and using these to fight back or to prosecute blogs or web-based news services is a growing trend, and it's definitely we find it problematic. And in the UK, they are actually trying to, I would say, address this issue, but it's an ongoing process. What we found is in certain other countries, you have servers that are refusing to host certain websites because of the content that they are carrying. So the legal ramifications are probably only set to grow. In terms of extra-legal repercussions, what we found was that harassment and violence had been increasing. There have been more detentions, intimidation, and torture of bloggers and online activists in a number of countries, as well as technical violence, sort of hacking or attacks on websites. Some of the most, I guess, prominent examples of this took place in Estonia and Georgia in the last few years, but it's sort of a very common and growing trend. And this was actually one of the main issues cited by Google in their recent decision to sort of change their policies in China. We also found that there was a wide range of surveillance and infringements on privacy in a very wide range of environments, so everywhere from the UK to countries like Tunisia, Iran, and China, that these issues were a concern. And in many cases also very hard to find out what is actually going on in terms of surveillance and infringements on privacy. I've talked a lot about some of the negatives. I wanted to also mention some of the positive trends. Not surprisingly, we found that in all the countries that we studied, which was 15, in every country in the study except the United Kingdom, it scored better on our Internet Freedom Index than in our traditional Press Freedom Index. So that was not unsurprising, but nevertheless confirmed for us that in general, Internet freedom there's more Internet freedom than there is in the traditional media environment. These differences were smaller among the better and worse performers in the study, but in the middle performers, we found that in some cases there was a very wide discrepancy in the difference between internet and traditional media freedom. So the graph shows the middle range performers, and you see, particularly in Malaysia and Russia, there was a very wide gap in terms of their level of traditional media freedom, which is in the purple, and then in internet freedom. However, what we did find was that it seemed like in many of these countries the gap was narrowing, and that with these increasing range of restrictions on internet freedom, that we can't always assume that the internet is going to be more free than the traditional media environment. So although this was a positive finding, we also would like to add a note of caution to that. Also, on the positive side, we found that there had been a growing pushback from bloggers and other users of ICTs against these threats, including the use of digital media to mobilize for political and social purposes, and that users were being increasingly sophisticated and creative in terms of their use of the new technologies. So in Cuba, for example, you have the use of sneaker nets and other sort of offline ICTs to spread news and information. So given the very, very limited access to the internet, what you find is, for example, people will, someone would download something from the internet and then spread it around, let's say using a flash drive or a CD-ROM or a video. In China, but you have the use of code words by users, so they will come up with let's say a word that sounds like another word and use that as sort of a code word when they're posting on message boards or in blogs. We also found more recently there was a huge pushback in China against efforts by the government to install sort of monitoring software on personal computers. So there is definitely a pushback on the user side, which is very positive. Other examples we've seen recently are the use of Facebook by activists in Egypt. And then just about a year ago in Iran, there was a huge use of Twitter, YouTube, Facebook by activists to get out information in the period after the disputed elections. There's also been increasing use of circumvention tools by activists to try and get around some of these growing restrictions on, on internet freedom. In more open environments, we've seen the use of Ushahidi, which was developed originally in Kenya as a sort of tool which basically uses text messages to map out. In Kenya, it was first used to map out sites of political violence and conflict during the elections several years ago. And this tool has been expanded in the last few years to be used in a variety of ways. It's been used to monitor elections in Afghanistan and Zimbabwe, as well as to be used for sort of more humanitarian efforts, such as the recent earthquake in Haiti. So the use of a lot of these technologies by users has been I would say one of the more positive things that we've seen in the last few years. In terms of the future, what we see is that as I mentioned, the growth of the mobile web and smartphones is going to increase access dramatically across the world. But we also see that more countries are censoring content, more sophisticated and a wider range of techniques are being used, and that in addition to sort of censoring, that there is also more manipulation and outsourcing of content controls. We also expect to see increasing violations of user rights in terms of both legal and extra-legal repercussions, and increasing issues concerning surveillance and privacy. And I think, given what we were talking about yesterday in terms of cloud computing and sort of the use of, or sort of the spread of a more globalized system where data is being stored in a variety of different countries, that's something that's only set to be a bigger concern as we go forward. Looking at some of the assumptions, I think maybe several years ago, or more than several years ago, there was just the widespread assumption that the spread of the internet and the globalization of the internet would lead to greater freedoms overall. But I think the last several years have shown us that it's definitely not an assumption we can take for granted, that greater, let's say, use of the technologies and spread of the technologies has not always led to greater freedoms, and has in some cases led to, in authoritarian governments, a widespread and multi-pronged sort of attack on these technologies. So as the internet develops and the use of the internet sort of gets more sophisticated, authoritarian governments are also getting more sophisticated in terms of their response. What we've seen is that I think they've realized that censoring or controlling every type of content is not something they can do or something they necessarily need to do, but by proactively, let's say, manipulating content and keeping enough restrictions in place to let's say, keep the lid under control, they are able to sort of keep political control despite the pushback from civil society in some cases. And I think the response needs to be a lot of foresight and creativity from countries with more open internet environments to try and help establish policies that will protect free expression in these new technologies and mediums. That's the end of the presentation. I wanted to leave enough time for comments and discussion. So anyway, that's the end. And I will put on the phones in case anyone has Spanish.
Crec que tenim temps suficient per algunes preguntes. Albert, Jordi.
Bé, bon dia. Se'm sent, oi? Sí. Jo només volia preguntar pel fet extraordinari, segons les dades que ha presentat, que el Regne Unit puntuï pitjor en la llibertat a internet en comparació a la llibertat a la premsa tradicional. Per què es dona això? Com és possible que hi hagi aquesta diferència del Regne Unit en relació als altres països on aquesta relació és inversa? Gràcies.
We found that the UK had several issues of concern which I would say are particularly an issue on the when you look at the internet. One, as I mentioned, is the issue of libel tourism and the use of the UK's very expansive libel laws, and this has been particularly an issue with regard to web-based publications. In addition, the UK did score badly on the questions concerning transparency of censorship. So the UK did score badly on questions concerning surveillance and privacy. This has been an issue with regard to the UK's sort of anti-terrorism legislation, and but this has affected things in terms of sort of data protection and user privacy. The UK also, we found, did not have a very transparent system in terms of censorship of content. It's possible to block web pages in the UK, and there isn't really a very good system for fighting these blockages. So those were three of the issues that we found that were particular issue in the UK. The UK did actually get I think it was a perfect score on the obstacles to access. So the issues that we found were mostly in terms of violation of user rights. But it was very interesting, and it was, as I noted, the only country where the score was worse on the internet freedom side. Although I would say it wasn't much worse. It was almost the same. But yeah, it was good for us, I think, that we included the UK in the study, because it definitely showed up the point that you can't always assume that the internet environment is going to be more free than the traditional media environment.
I'm basically concerned about what are known as liberal democracies, rather than those that are known to be authoritarian. I mean, recently, we'll be looking at cybersecurity later today, but the moves towards tighter security also go along with less freedom of information, particularly in freedom of expression. I'm surprised the USA wasn't included in the study, because we saw yesterday that it was recorded as being one of the countries where government or the authorities do most or have most tight monitoring of content. Also, homeland security is an issue that's inciting not only on freedom of the press but also on internet content. So the pilot didn't include the USA. Will it be included in the further studies, and what do they look like for liberal democracies in general, but the USA in particular?
Yeah, no, we wanted to actually include it in the pilot, but the money that we had gotten for the pilot was actually from the U.S. State Department, and so we weren't allowed to cover the U.S. We do intend to cover it in the follow-on study, where we will be expanding, almost doubling the number of countries. What we really are hoping to do in that study is to expand, all the types of countries in each region, but also include several other of what you would say sort of liberal democracies. So the U.S., I think, will be included, Germany as well, and maybe one or two others. And you're exactly right. I mean, what we would expect is that the U.S., this study will show up that the U.S. does also have significant problems in terms of a number of these areas, both in terms of some of the legislation which allows it to infringe on user rights and privacy issues, as well as some of the other issues. So I'm very much looking forward to seeing the results of the study, and the U.S. will definitely be included in that. Because what we've found overall is that, that there are a number of different issues also present in these democracies. I mean, you find, I think, there's obviously less, I think, of a concern maybe with overt violations or widespread blocking or censorship, but what we see is that the privacy and surveillance issues are much more prominent in these countries. it was actually interesting when we were developing the methodology to begin with. We tried to get a wide range of responses from people both in the US and in Europe and in a number of other countries. And what we found was that activists or experts based in the US and Europe were much more concerned with these types of issues of privacy and security and felt that they should play a much bigger role in the methodology itself. When we talked to, let's say, specialists from countries like India, they were also much more concerned about sort of basic access, which, as you would expect, would be much more of an issue in an environment like that. So when we settled and finalized the methodology, we tried to take all of these comments into consideration and sort of balance all the issues that could be applicable in different countries. But definitely in the US and Europe, the privacy and surveillance issues, I think, are much more paramount than they are elsewhere.
M'ha sorprès una mica el fet que dintre de la llista d'aspectes de mitjans, diguem-ne, de censura, ha inclòs el de treure els continguts quan hi ha una ordre judicial. No sé realment si realment és la categoria, o sigui, incloure les ordres judicials dintre la categoria de censura, no sé si realment és adequat, perquè a vegades s'infringeixen drets de propietat intel·lectual o hi ha un atemptat contra la intimitat d'una persona i fa falta treure aquell contingut, no? I per això una mica m'ha sorprès això, no?
It definitely does, I think, depend on the country and the type of judicial order. What we found was that, and you know, you are right in that there are sort of legitimate reasons for a judge to, let's say, to order that content be removed. What we were interested in overall was sort of I think the transparency and proportionality of the system. And we did find that in a number of countries, even relatively free ones, that there were in some cases sort of excessive judicial activism and moves by judges to take down content, which in many other countries you might not find to be objectionable or to be a problem. Brazil was an example of a country where judicial orders are extremely common and have had a chilling effect on a sort of online freedom of speech. So we looked at that. There were also issues concerning the UK, where in many cases judges are sort of excessively applying the libel laws and taking very expansive sort of views of the libel laws. And it's interesting that it's particular judges, so it's not, let's say, the legal system as a whole, but particular judges are taking very expansive views. So we tried to balance it, but we did see that in certain countries, judges were being very excessive with the orders to block or remove content. So we wanted to include this in censorship, although it is, as you said, a very different type of censorship than sort of the technical filtering or blocking on a more technical level. But in some countries it is quite an issue, and we found that in Brazil it had led to sort of more self-censorship and restriction and sort of excessive restrictions on freedom of speech. So we did want to include it in some way in the methodology.
My turn. So we have WikiLeaks that they break the Tor system to anonymize communications. If anyone is aware of the Tor system, it's a way where you can surf the internet and even send emails anonymously. So WikiLeaks, it's almost demonstrated that they broke the system. They interfered communications. They got encrypted content, some from the US State Department, some from other people. They put it online, and when they are going to get sued, they have a safe harbor, even that they haven't in Iceland. So where is the limit? I mean, it's like more than like the Cayman Islands, where we can have data havens that we call they are for freedom of speech, but actually it's like libel tourism. Or do we really need these data havens?
Well, I think there's probably a balance. What worried us also, when we look globally, is that there has been sort of a very positive use of Tor and some of the circumvention technologies to get around, some of these issues. I mean, some of these technologies are being used by, let's say, activists in very repressive countries, and some are being used by, by people in America or Europe who just want to protect their privacy. And one of the growing things that we've seen globally is that in a number of countries, governments are actually trying to block access to these circumvention tools as well as to other applications. So that was something that we noted. I mean, that's not really an issue, I think, in the US, but it is an issue in a number of other environments. When we designed the methodology, we were of the view that blocking of the circumvention tools was also sort of a bad thing, and that people should be able to use them if they would like. On our program side, Freedom House has been involved in programs that train activists in more repressive environments and how to use these technologies to safely communicate both with each other and with groups in the outside world. So I would say overall we're in favor of of access to these technologies.
So yes to Iceland?
Iceland is ranks very. It would be interesting to include it in the Internet Freedom Index as well. I don't think it will be, but on our Press Freedom Index, it is actually ranked one of the best in the world. And they actually recently, were passing legislation to only increase those protections. So we're in favor of Iceland.
Okay. Si us sembla, avancem al cafè 5 minutets, si no hi ha cap més pregunta. I moltíssimes gràcies.
Okay, thank you. And I do have some maps and other handouts up here, so if anyone's interested, we do have those, and we'll put them outside as well, but if anyone's interested.
Els deixarem allà a l'entrada i us podeu recollir.
Okay. Thank you very much.